This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. In this episode, I speak with performance psychologist Dr. Noa Kageyama, and he talks to me about how to beat performance anxiety and perform at your very best if you're up on a stage or you're speaking to other people. It's a really fascinating interview, and he also discusses the role of nutrition and hydration on giving a great performance. Enjoy this episode. Hey, it's James Taylor, and I'm excited to bring you our featured guest today. His name is Dr. Noa Kageyama, and Noa is a New York-based performance psychologist and former classical violinist. He has worked with everyone from music students at Juilliard and Oberlin to members of the US Armed Forces School of Music. Noa's skill is being able to help talented musicians prepare for orchestra job auditions, understand performance enhancement, and overcome performance anxiety. And so, Noa, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So share with our listeners what's going on in your world just now.
Well, I'm in the middle of trying to work on this third edition of this online home study course that I have. It's based on the teaching that I do at Juilliard and elsewhere. And what I discovered a while ago that is kind of cool with the internet is that it allows you to connect with all sorts of people. I mean, like we are right now, across oceans and time zones. So that's a thing that I'm kind of immersed in right now. As well as just kind of getting ready for the holiday season.
Fantastic. And so obviously you had this former life, I could say, as a violinist. That's how you started very, very early playing violin. And then you went into the traditional route into, I believe it was in Juilliard as well. But then something changed. You got this interest in psychology and sports psychology. Talk to us about that journey initially.
Well, yeah, like you said, I started really early. I was about two and a half when I first expressed an interest in music, and so my mom got me, connected with a little tiny violin and a Suzuki program nearby. And actually, when I was 5, she's from Japan, so we went over to Japan for about half a year, and I got to study with Dr. Suzuki for a while. And so it was pretty serious from an early age, and I didn't really know what that meant, but I remember being, probably 5 years old, 6 years old, and experiencing what I now know is anxiety. Like, as a 5 to 6 year old, you don't really know what it is. You just feel funny inside. And memory slips and the whole 9 yards. I experienced lots of things on stage, but mostly it was the frustration of just knowing how much better I could sound and not being able to figure out how to demonstrate that in key performances or auditions or competitions. So I'd always had that in the back of my mind. I couldn't ever get any satisfactory answers, or let alone, action plans or strategies to better handle performances and play the way that I knew I could. And so I continued on, and like you said, eventually I found my way to Juilliard for my master's degree, and I was lucky that there was a sports psychologist there at the time who was teaching a class called performance enhancement. And some of your listeners are probably familiar with him. His name is Don Green, and he worked with Greg Louganis, Olympic diving team back in the 80s, and was starting to work with musicians. And I'd never heard of sports psychology. I mean, nowadays I think a lot of people have heard of it, but back in the 90s, it wasn't something that was so commonly talked about. So it was just eye-opening in so many different respects for me to see that there was an actual field of inquiry and research completely oriented around trying to help talented, high-level performers do their best when it actually mattered most, even if you're feeling a lot of pressure and nerves. So changed the way that I practiced, it changed the way that I approached performing, and changed the way that I felt about everything as well. And I was seeing amazing consistency starting to happen for myself and my friends and colleagues in the class. And I wanted to know more. And it was also about the time when, like you start trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I didn't have anything more exciting that I could think about. Because I wasn't that interested in performing in an orchestra or an ensemble or even a solo career, if that was possible for me. And teaching wasn't something that interested me either. So, I mean, as a musician, those are kind of the main things that you do. And so, it's kind of thinking, what am I going to do next year? And this was the most exciting thing that I could think of. So I put down my violin and went back to school to pursue psychology.
And I've spoken to a lot of musicians who they quote a book a lot that helped them. I think it was called The Inner Game of Golf, which obviously comes from the sports psychology. I believe there's now an inner game of music as well. I think I'm not sure the name of the author as well. So,
Right.
of your peer group, kind of growing up, how was this being talked about, or was it just not talked about? This idea of the inner game, the mental game of playing.
Yeah, I don't think it was talked about. I actually read The Inner Game of Tennis when I was a kid, and I happened to be interested in tennis, so that's kind of the context in which I read it. And I never really thought to apply it to music. I'm not sure why, but it never clicked for me. I have a colleague in the Los Angeles Philharmonic who played golf as a kid and read The Inner Game of Tennis and connected it to his golf game, and I think also to his music. But there were two things that really weren't talked about. One, nerves wasn't something that was really talked about very much. I mean, it seemed like if you got nervous, well, then there was something wrong. Maybe you weren't practicing enough, or you just weren't cut out to be a performer, or I think it just was something that was kind of in that survival of the fittest mentality. And so that was part of it. But then you're right. I mean, the idea that our ability to perform under pressure or our ability to just perform and be great artists was at all connected to the mental side of things was something that was really talked about much either.
So I imagine, most of your day is either working with very high level people that are trying to work at a high level, either in sports or in music. So the question I always ask my guests is like, what does the first hour of your day look like? And that's really asking about, daily rituals and daily habits. So I'm going to ask you in a slightly different way. One is, let's talk about, what does your first hour of your day look like? And then what does the first hour of your day look like amongst the people who that you've worked with who are at the top of what they do?
Well, for me, it's, I wake up and I go right to the gym, and then I come back and drink some protein and get the kids ready for school. And then this is not something that I think is recommended, but I try to get email out of the way first, because then I can really focus on the things that I want to focus on, whether it's reading or writing or working with clients and things like that. And I wish I could give you like a formulaic answer for what top performers seem to do, but it seems to be different, because some people, they wake up and they have a routine like, going for a bike ride or working out and breakfast, and then start their day with, practicing, things like that. Other people don't necessarily do the practicing right away and kind of get to it later. And I think what is maybe consistently different about folks who seem to be able to produce at a higher level more consistently is that they do have a routine. I think a lot of folks kind of just go with whatever the day presents, whereas the folks who really seem to have their stuff together do have some sort of routine and kind of impose the routine on the day and structure the day around a routine that they know is essential for them. So maybe that's the best answer, that there is a routine of some sort, and they don't just let the day kind of dictate terms.
So they've discovered what kind of works for them, what works for their mentally, their body, when they're at their most, their creative power is at their highest as well.
Right, exactly.
And then talk to me about, so as well as being obviously coming initially from being a violinist, and now you're involved in more the psychological part of this world of music as well. But let's I don't want to put you on the spot here, but what would you say is your biggest weakness as a music artist and as actually a creative person? Because I'm generally of the view that we all creative in one way or the other as well. But when you come to think of yourself as the creative person as opposed to in some of these other areas, what would you say is one of your biggest weaknesses?
I don't know if this is true, but I've found that oftentimes, at least in the psychology world, working with folks, that it's oftentimes the flip side of our greatest strengths that ends up being our greatest weakness. And so for me, one of the biggest things I took from music and learned from music is the sense of pursuing excellence and nothing ever being quite good enough. And there's always more that you can do and always a higher standard to strive for and reach for. And I love that. I mean, when I play video games, the kinds of video games that I gravitate towards are like racing games or time-based games where there's a very concrete measure of success, and you're always trying to do better and cut corners a little more sharply and whatnot. And with working out, it's always about weights and repetitions, and with music, it was always a slightly more richer sound or more subtle this or that nuance. And so that's what's been probably the most helpful skill that I brought to psychology and my studies there and my work there. But it also can be inhibitory in the sense that nothing's ever quite good enough, and it's hard to let things go, and knowing when to stop can be difficult. So even things like trying to balance family with work, and it's like, I want to work on this thing and make this thing a little bit better. And even with the website, it's like, does it really matter how effectively the fonts are spaced from each other and the headers? And I think it's easy sometimes for me to kind of get too focused with a microscope and dig too deep, and really at the end of the day, if that keeps me from providing more valuable information for people, if it keeps me from spending time with my family, if it keeps me from just kind of getting sleep sometimes, it ends up being bad for everybody involved.
This stress to perform at the highest level. I suppose there's different ways we can look at stress. There's, what is it? I think it's the Greek version, which is eustress, which is good stress, and obviously distress as well. I was talking to someone the other day from the classical side who works in California, and they were talking about the high rate of kids doing auditions using beta blockers and different ways to deal with anxiety. So when people are kind of presenting to you and coming to you for help, have they kind of done things like that already, and it's just not working, or they've tried different other things, other kind of strategies, and it's just not quite working, and they kind of come to you just saying like, no, please help me get my game together here?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of folks who have experimented with beta blockers or other particular techniques or strategies, and a lot of times, they end up coming to me because they've tried other things, obviously, but they still can't get to that place where they feel like they have a consistent game plan or set of strategies or weapons or tools or method to consistently go out on stage and play the way that they know they can. It just continues to be hit or miss, or they feel like something works for a few weeks, but then it suddenly doesn't, and they're not quite sure what changed or what's going on. And beta blockers is an interesting subject because you're talking about eustress versus distress or anxiety, and sports psychologists have looked at anxiety from a couple different angles and have broken it down where it's really not this single unidimensional phenomenon. There's these two components of it. There's a mental component of performance stress, which is called cognitive anxiety. That's the stuff like you're worrying about things or doubting yourself or second guessing or having fear or panicky feelings and those sorts of things. And then there's the physical side of things, or the somatic anxiety, and that's heart pounding and sweating and getting tight and feeling jittery and the butterflies in your stomach. And the beta blockers, assuming correct dosage and timing and things like that, for a lot of people will it's going to handle the somatic stuff. It'll kind of regulate your heartbeat and reduce your blood pressure and things like that. But interestingly, when you look at the research, the somatic anxiety is not actually a particularly good predictor of performance quality. What's a more effective or more valid predictor of performance quality is actually the cognitive anxiety, the worries, the doubts, how focused we are in the performance. And so the beta blockers don't directly impact that. For some folks, it doesn't matter because once you take the physical things off the table, they're not worried anymore, and they can focus and get into the moment and do what they need to do. But a lot of people, even if you take the physical stuff off the table, they're still worried about what's going to happen or what the audience might think or what the judges may think or what might happen if they have a memory slip or whether they are going to be able to perform at the level that they expect to. And so when those worries are still going on, it means that they're not in the moment, they're not in the zone, they're not able to perform in a particularly compelling way, and their performances still suffer from that. So yeah, when we end up working together, one of the cool things about sports psychology is, it comes from a variety of angles. It's about trying to make sure that we understand how to get into the most optimal mental state, physical state, and emotional state. And if we can do those three things consistently, it means that our performances tend to be a lot more consistent as well. And that, knowing that we have that control, I mean, for me, that was what kind of sold me on the need for me to pursue sports psychology. It's like, it's amazing to be able to get on stage and know exactly what to do and be able to predict pretty, consistently, if I do these three things, these four things, these five things, it's probably going to go pretty well. And for that to play out time and again was one of the coolest things for me, at least personally, to experience.
So give our listeners a bit of an insight into what those two or three of those things may be, in terms of dealing with or ensuring a certain level of consistency in their performance.
It's different things for different people, but I'll give you one example that's pretty universal, in that, you watch basketball players before they hit a free throw, or golfers before they hit a shot, or soccer players before, football players before shooting or kicking a penalty kick. And a lot of them tend to have, at least the more consistent ones, tend to have what looks like kind of a superstitious ritual before they execute their skill. So basketball player, Steve Nash, for instance, in the United States, was known for shooting 3 or 4 imaginary free throws before he even took the ball and then shot an actual free throw. And there's a reason why they do this. It's not actually superstition, but it's called a pre-performance routine. And there's a particularly interesting study they did with golf, where they took a bunch of folks and had them try to execute these putts at various distances with stakes involved, so money or pressure. They were being filmed by a TV show, things like that. And so they were put under some pressure. And meanwhile, they had them hooked up to EEGs to measure what's going on in different parts of the brain right before they putted. And the successful putters and the unsuccessful putters had different brain activation patterns. Successful putters had a lot more right brain activity and very little left brain activity right before their putt. And so the researchers asked them, so there's something different going on in your brain right before you putt. What are you thinking about? And the unsuccessful putters said it was a lot of self-coaching dialogue, what to do with their hands, with their stance, and basically almost like having a coach on your shoulder telling you all the things to do and all the things not to do right before you execute a putt. The successful golfers, on the other hand, said it was a lot more simple. They just had 2 things in mind right before the putt. Had a clear visual target, they knew exactly where they wanted to hit the ball. And they also tried to recall the feel of a really smooth, successful putt. Not the emotional feel, but the physical feeling, kinesthetically, of a smooth, successful putt. So those 2 things were part of what they did right before executing the putt. So for musicians as well, a lot of times, especially as students, you'll see students walk up on stage and get ready to play, and without thinking, almost just kind of dive right in. Or maybe before they play, they're telling us, okay, don't miss this, don't miss this, don't screw this up, don't make any mistakes, and they'll kind of just dive right in without really preparing themselves. But the more successful, consistent performers, they get up on stage, they'll take a moment to compose themselves. And when they compose themselves, it's oftentimes something very specific, something like releasing muscle tension from the shoulders or their arms. And in addition to that, one of the things that I work on with a lot of folks is having at least these 2 things as part of your pre-performance routine. Get a clear sound in your head, right? It's not a visual target, it's an auditory target. Hear exactly, with every nuance and detail, exactly what you want the opening to sound like, the opening note, the opening gesture. And then remember what it feels like when it's effortless, when it's easy, and you get exactly what it is that you hear in your head. How does that feel? And so maybe take a deep breath, release tension, cue those 2 things up in your head, and then go for it, and then let loose, and then trust that it's going to work out. And we practice this over and over and over and over and over, so that this routine itself becomes automatic, and it's almost like it creates a sense of inevitability about what's about to happen. And when you've practiced this hundreds of times, thousands of times before you start, it makes the start of a performance so much more consistent, so much better. It makes it so much easier to get into the zone right from the very first note, and then stay there and ensure that the rest of your performance goes well also.
So it's like almost you're kind of anchoring in a certain way to get into some kind of virtuous circle. So so that you're anchoring, getting that feeling again, anchoring it, which you can then use again for the next performance and then the next performance. So it just kind of builds upon itself.
Exactly. Right.
I suppose it reminds me a little bit of, talking about violin, the French jazz violinist Stephane Grappelli, who had he said begin well, Actually, I think it was Maurice Chevalier actually taught him, but he said begin well, end well, and the middle will take care of itself.
Right,
So he
right.
kind of, they kind of knew, and I see this a lot with jazz performers where they'll have the idea of like even though people think it's an entirely improvised show, they're quite clear in the first, say, 2 or 3 numbers, and they're clear in the end, and then they basically they'll feel the middle, and they'll feel the audience what to respond to the audience. So talk to me about also things like diet. Do they have a role? So diet, and when I say diet, I also mean water and other things as well. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It was talking about some research they did in, I think it was Israel, around decision making. And so what they did, they would, I think they took a whole bunch of judges who are on parole boards, and then they would look at their decisions before at different points in the day. And what they essentially found was that you were much more unlikely to be let off later in the day or just before lunch when the judges were slightly cranky because they hadn't had any food really. And so does that have any kind of, and part of the reason that they looked at the physiology of that is obviously like glucose level, because when you're having to make decisions and they have to make lots and lots of decisions very quickly, you're using up high levels of glucose, which is why probably like President Obama wears the same suit every day, and they used to reduce those numbers of decisions that you have to make. So talk to me about the kind of dietary side. Is there any effect? Because obviously in sports that's a big thing that they're thinking about all the time, but does it have any relation to music?
They haven't really studied this so much specifically with musicians, but musicians for some reason haven't identified themselves as athletes, although that doesn't make much sense, right? I mean, what musicians do is so physical, and there's so much coordination and environmental control required, and timing and things like that, that there's no reason why they shouldn't be considered, at least their activities being just as athletic as a lot of other athletes who are involved in similar kinds of physical activities. Dancers are certainly more cautious or more conscious of nutrition and hydration and things like that. To me, it's kind of a no-brainer. I think that musicians, that's probably going to be one of the next areas that musicians start trying to focus more on, not just physical fitness, but also nutrition and hydration. There's some studies on hydration that I found particularly interesting with golfers, not just in terms of decision-making, but what happens is it seems like when we're mildly dehydrated, everything becomes more effortful. We might still be able to perform at the same level, but it takes more work or feels like more work. And so when we have a really grueling tour, or even just in the context of one audition, a span of 2 days, 3 days maybe, we don't want everything that we do to feel like it takes more effort. It takes more out of us. We want to feel fresher. And at the end of the audition in the finals or the super finals, at midnight, say, we're playing and we're not expecting to be playing that late, to be able to not have kind of wasted your energy beforehand by making everything more effortful, but making sure you've kind of conserved energy and staying hydrated and eating properly so that we don't have these insulin spikes because we're eating junk food and things like that. So, to answer your question, certainly I think it's a big factor to consider, but I just don't think people have really looked at it so far.
And does technology start to play a role now? You know, we have watches who can track your sleep patterns, your steps, a whole bunch of different kind of biometrics and things. Has there been any work started around how to use technology to improve the performance of the individual musician? I'm not thinking in terms of like the equipment, the gear that they're playing and things, but actually about them as the individual, getting the best from them and ensuring that they're in the best peak state.
That's a good point. I mean, I have a little sleep app on my phone that tells me if I've had a good night's sleep or not. And I was talking to somebody the other day with these Fitbits, I think they're called. You wear them on your wrist, and this new model apparently is able to track, or at least use some kind of an algorithm to gauge your stress level. And that, I think you're right. That's probably another area too in which things are going to be going, and people are going to try to tweak these things that I think are so key and so fundamental and so important, but because we haven't been able to measure them so well, or it's been too difficult to measure them, they haven't been looked at. But now that it's easier to start measuring these things, I think people are going to look at it more and more as a way to enhance the performance. I mean, even things like how easy now it is to record yourself and listen back. That's something that people are starting to take more advantage of. And so, yeah, I think that's a big area for folks to start getting into and start.
And then when you're working with you're working with clients and are you often having them film like a sports psychologist would do, where they're filming so you can see all these little as they say in poker, the tells, the little things that maybe physically that are going on in addition to the mental stuff?
Yeah, for me the biggest thing is so what's interesting about practicing is that when we're practicing effectively, we're listening really carefully, right? We're self-monitoring, and we're listening for glitches and mistakes and errors and things that don't sound the way we want them to. So we're having to evaluate and critique as we're also playing, which means that our mind is doing two basically incompatible things, right? We're trying to create. At the same time, we're trying to critique that thing that we're creating. And when we listen to something, it's already happened. So when we're creating, we have to be kind of out in front, proactively doing something and creating something and saying something. When we're listening, when we're critiquing, we're constantly in the past. And so it's sort of like this incompatible thing that we're trying to do at the same time. So recording-wise, and then when we're performing, right? When we're performing on stage, if we start self-monitoring and critiquing in the way that we need to in the practice room, we're constantly like behind, and basically we kind of set ourselves up to fail because we start generally not thinking, oh, we're doing great. We start thinking, oh, how did that happen? Or why did I do that? Or, oh, that's not how it's supposed to sound. And we kind of energy-wise go down, and we start being more discouraged about how things are going. And it's not the most compelling experience for either us or the listener. So with recording, the main thing that I like with recording is it allows you to outsource the task of critiquing and monitoring to the recording device. So when you're playing for a recording device, your job is to create and to play and to get out in front and be proactive and focus on shaping and articulation and sound and those sorts of things, and to not listen to how things are going. And so with the recording device on, you can do that. You don't have to listen to how things are going because you can listen back later, and then you can do all the analyzing and critiquing. So when clients start doing this, they have a hard time kind of flipping that switch on and off from listening mode and critiquing mode to performing and creating mode. And that's, for me, one of the big things that we end up doing with recording, to ask them, what were you thinking about? Because if they're thinking about lunch, if they're thinking about a mistake they just made, or if they're thinking about the difficult thing coming up and worrying about it, I say, well, we need to fix that. We need to find something else for you to think about so you can be really engaged, really present, and really focused on saying something and creating something instead of monitoring and evaluating while you're trying to also create at the same time.
So if our listeners are interested in learning more about this world, so they feel themselves, they have maybe levels of anxiety around performing, what are some resources that you would suggest that they check out? Are there books? I know maybe talk about your online course as well, and how that is structured. Give them some signposts, some places where they can go and learn more about this.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, as you know, I write about this every week, and it's all research-based, and every week I'll find a new concept or strategy or technique to apply to one's practice, preparation, and performance. But there are 3 books that are, I guess, my favorites when it comes to practicing more effectively and being more efficient in the practice room, and also how to develop some of these mental skills that elite athletes have benefited from for decades, and musicians are just now starting to benefit from as well. One of my favorite books on learning is called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, by Brown, Roediger, and McDaniel. Roediger and McDaniel are 2 well-respected researchers in the field of learning, and Brown is a writer. So, this combination of this trio, entertaining stories, but also really compelling research that you can trust because it's by people who are doing this kind of research on a day-to-day basis. As far as the mental preparation goes, my mentor Don Green wrote a book a number of years ago called Performance Success, and for me it's very action-oriented. It's not just conceptual or abstract, but it's okay. So these are the things you need to work on. this is how you do it. This is the exercise. Do this X number of times, or do this, in this sort of way. And it walks you through exactly how to develop some of these skills. And it even includes a mental skills assessment that you can take to find out what your mental strengths and weaknesses are. And there's another book called 10-Minute Toughness by Jason Selk, who's the sports psychologist for the St. Louis Cardinals here in the U.S. Baseball team. His book is also very action-oriented. It's like a 10-minute routine that you do every day, every morning, to start developing some of these skills that you can then use in performance settings. And so the course that I teach as well, it's a home study course that you can take online at your own pace, and it's modeled around the classes that I teach at Juilliard. It walks you through, and it starts off with a mental skills assessment that was actually developed also by Don Green. And then it walks you through these 7 skills, from anxiety regulation and how to manage nerves, to proper practice and preparation strategies, to concentration and focus and trust and courage and bouncing back from mistakes, mental toughness, all these sorts of things. And it walks you through exactly how to work on these things, exercises, worksheets, just so that you don't have to wonder, how do I do this? This is exactly how you do it. And then you continue to take the assessment and perform and see how things change.
And that's great. And we'll put all these in the show notes here. So, it's fantastic that, you obviously, you're in a position where you teach these very fortunate students who are coming to Juilliard, but now what you teach is available to a much, much wider audience as well. And it's just fantastic, with online learning and things like Coursera and Udemy and Udacity. It's amazing point in history just now that we're going. And someone told me a figure the other day that in the next 18 months, something like 2 billion new people are going to be coming online from sub-Saharan Africa and mostly South America and some parts of Southeast Asia. So that's incredible. It's and they're going to have access to this, which even 10 years ago people would only have dreamed about. So you're doing great work. You're doing really important work, Noah, as well. I really, on behalf of our listeners, kind of commend you for what you're doing, and people should go and check out the Bulletproof Musician and find out more and read out more about what you're doing. Are there any other things you'd like to suggest as we kind of finish off? If there's one thing that people can do today to just help a little bit with the anxiety, they're going to be doing a concert at the end of the week, or a show at the end of the week. Is there one little tip that you can leave them with just now to help them give a better show?
Sure. Are you a roller coaster person, James? Like, you love roller coasters?
I am not that person.
Okay. Well, I'm not either. I'm not a big fan of roller coasters, and so my experience getting on a roller coaster is one that I would characterize more as fear, right, or anxiety. Whereas other people who are roller coaster people, they don't characterize it as fear, anxiety. It's excitement to them, right? They can't wait. And interestingly, though, so they call it excitement, we call it fear, anxiety, but physiologically, it's basically the same experience, right? Heart rate goes up and start pounding, and you start sweating and get a little bit tight, maybe, and so it's the same thing actually with music, and they've done some studies in this area. They had, one group of participants about to sing something say, "I'm excited." Another group was required to say, "I'm anxious." And it didn't matter how they were actually feeling; they were just told to say these things. And funny enough, the group that said, "I'm excited," they scored higher, in singing accuracy. Their scores, I think, somewhere in the low 90% range. And the folks who are required to say, "I'm anxious," their scores were in the 50-something range. Folks who weren't asked anything at all scored somewhere in the middle. And they did this with public speaking. One group was required to say, "I'm excited." The other group was required to say, "I'm calm." Again, irregardless of how they're feeling. Group required to say, "I'm excited," scored higher across the board in all these different areas. It actually gave longer speeches on average, too. So it sounds so simple that it couldn't possibly be helpful, but simply saying, "I'm excited," and trying to attribute everything that we're experiencing to being excited, because we've all had performances where we really were excited. We had the butterflies and we were nervous, but it was also super exciting, and our performances went really well. So just reattributing what we're experiencing to excitement as opposed to fear or anxiety is one small thing that can be done, but also very impactful at the same time.
Well, no, that's great, and a great little piece of advice to get to leave people with. So what website should people go to learn more about you and your courses and what you're up to?
If you go to bulletproofmusician.com, there's a link right on the homepage to the blog, to the course, and also to coaching if people are interested in one-on-one. And there's also a way to subscribe and get some cool goodies that are set up, a practice hacking guide and also a quick start guide to help people navigate the site more effectively and find what they're looking for.
Nice. Well, thank you, Noah. It's been great speaking to you. I look forward to meeting you in person some point as well.
Absolutely.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.